So, I'm going to be reading my book. Got my candle back because I've cut the wick now. I've just, I lost, like the bookmark fell out of my book, so I think I'm reading from the right place, but I'm not 100% sure. Chapter 5. The imperfections of the capital vice of anger into which beginners fall. 1. Because of the strong desire of many beginners for spiritual gratification, they usually have many imperfections of anger. When the delight and satisfaction procured in their spiritual exercises passes, these beginners are naturally left without any spiritual server. And because of this distastefulness, they become peevish in the works they do, and easily angered by the least thing, and occasionally they are so unbearable that nobody can put up with them. This frequently occurs after they have experienced in prayer some recollection pleasant to the senses. After the delight and satisfaction are gone, the sensory part of the soul is naturally left vapid and zestless, just as a child is when withdrawn from the sweet breast. These souls are not at fault if they do not allow this dejection to influence them, for it is an imperfection that they must be purged through. For it is an imperfection that they must be purged through the dryness and distress of the dark night. 2. Among these spiritual persons, there are also those who fall into another kind of spiritual anger. Through a certain indiscreet zeal, they become angry over the sins of others, reprove these others, and sometimes even feel the impulse to do so angrily, which in fact they occasionally do, setting themselves up as lords of virtue. All such conduct is contrary to spiritual meekness. 3. Others, in becoming aware of their own imperfections, grow angry with themselves in an unhumble impatience. So impatient are they about these imperfections that they want to become saints in a day. Many of these beginners make numerous plans and great resolutions, but since they are not humble and have no distrust of themselves, the more resolves they make, the more they break, and the greater becomes their anger. They do not have the patience to wait until God gives them what they need, when He so desires. Their attitude is contrary to the spiritual meekness, and can only be remedied by the purgation of the dark night. Some, however, are so patient about their desire for advancement that God would prefer to see them a little less so. Chapter 6. The imperfections of spiritual gluttony. A great deal can be said on spiritual gluttony, the fourth vice. There are hardly any persons among these beginners, no matter how excellent their conduct, who do not fall into some of the many imperfections of this vice. These imperfections arise because of the delight beginners find in their spiritual exercises. Many, lured by the delight and satisfaction procured in their religious practices, strive more for spiritual savour than for spiritual purity and discretion. Yet it is this purity and discretion that God looks for and finds acceptable throughout a soul's entire spiritual journey. Besides the imperfection of seeking after these delights, the sweetness these persons experience makes them go to extremes and pass beyond the mean in which virtue resides and is acquired. Some, attracted by the delight they feel in their spiritual exercises, kill themselves with penances, and others weaken themselves by fasts without the counsel or command of another, overtax their weakness. Indeed, they try to hide these penances from the one to whom they owe obedience in such matters. Some even dare perform these penances contrary to obedience. 2. Such individuals are unreasonable and most imperfect. They subordinate. Such individuals are unreasonable and most imperfect. They subordinate submissiveness and obedience, which is a penance of reason and discretion, and consequently a sacrifice more pleasing and acceptable to God, to corporeal penance. But corporeal penance without obedience is no more than a penance of beasts, and like beasts they are motivated in these penances, by an appetite for the pleasure they find in them. Since all extremes are vicious, and since by such behaviour these persons are doing their own will, they grow in vice rather than in virtue. For through this conduct they at least become spiritually gluttonous and proud, since they do not tread the path of obedience. The devil, increasing the delights and appetites of these beginners, and thereby stirring up this gluttony in them, so impels many of them, that when they are unable to avoid obedience, they either add to, change, or modify what was commanded. Any obedience in this matter is distasteful to them. Some reach such a point that the mere obligation of obedience to perform their spiritual exercises makes them lose all desire and devotion. Their only yearning and satisfaction is to do what they feel inclined to do, whereas it would be better, in all likelihood, for them not to do this at all. 3. Some are very insistent that their spiritual director allow them to do what they themselves want to do, and finally almost force the permission from him. And if they do not get what they want, they become sad and go about like tester children. They are under the impression that they do not serve God when they are not allowed to do what they want. Since they take gratification and their own will as their support and their God, they become sad, weak, and discouraged when their director takes these from them and desires that they do God's will. They think that gratifying and satisfying themselves is serving and satisfying God. 4. Others too, because of this sweetness, have so little knowledge of their own lowliness and misery, and such lack of the loving fear and respect they owe to God's grandeur, that they do not hesitate to insist boldly that their confessors allow them the frequent reception of communion. And worse than this, they often dare to receive communion without the permission and advice of the minister and dispenser of Christ. They are guided here solely by their own opinion, and they endeavour to hide the truth from him. As a result, with their hearts set on frequent communion, they make their confessions carelessly, more eager just to receive communion than to receive it with a pure and perfect heart. It would be sounder and holier of them to have the contrary inclination, and to ask their confessor not to let them receive communion so frequently. Humble resignation, though, is better than either of these two attitudes, but the boldness referred to first will bring great evil and chastisement on one. 5. In receiving communion, they spend all their time trying to get some feeling and satisfaction, rather than humbly praising and reverencing God dwelling within them. And they go about this in such a way that, if they do not procure any sensible feeling and satisfaction, they think they have accomplished nothing. As a result, they judge very poorly of God and fail to understand that the sensory benefits are the least among those that this most blessed sacrament bestows. For the invisible grace it gives is a greater blessing. God often withdraws sensory delight and pleasure, so that souls might set the eyes of faith on this invisible grace. Not only in receiving communion, but in other spiritual exercises as well, beginners desire to feel God and taste him, as if he were comprehensible and accessible. This desire is a serious imperfection, and because it involves impurity of faith, is opposed to God's word. 6. They have the same defect in their prayer, for they think the whole matter of prayer consists in looking for sensory satisfaction and devotion. They strive to procure this by their own efforts, and tire and weary their heads and their faculties. When they do not get this sensible comfort, they become very disconsolate and think they have done nothing. Because of their aim, they lose true devotion and spirit, which lie in distrust of self and in humble and patient perseverance, so as to please God. Once they do not find delight in prayer, or in any other spiritual exercise, they feel extreme reluctance and repugnance in returning to it, and sometimes even give it up. For after all, as was mentioned, they are like children who are prompted to act not by reason but by pleasure. All their time is spent looking for satisfaction and spiritual consolation. They can never read enough spiritual books, and one minute they are meditating on one subject, and the next on another, always hunting for some gratification in the things of God. God very rightly and discreetly and lovingly denies this satisfaction to these beginners. If he did not, they would fall into innumerable evils because of their spiritual gluttony and craving for sweetness. This is why it is important for these beginners to enter the dark night and be purged of this childishness. There's a footnote here. Throughout these chapters, describing the situation of beginners in regard to each capital vice, John repeatedly points out their need for the purification of the dark night, which he begins to treat in chapter 8. 7. Those who are inclined toward these delights have also another serious imperfection, which is that they are weak and remiss in treading the rough way of the cross. A soul given up to pleasure naturally feels aversion toward the bitterness of self-denial. 8. These people incur many other imperfections because of this spiritual gluttony, of which the Lord in time will cure them through temptations, aridities, and other trials, which are all a part of the dark night. So as not to be too lengthy, I do not want to discuss these imperfections anymore, but only point out that spiritual sobriety and temperance beget another very different quality, one of mortification, fear, and submissiveness in all things. Individuals thereby become aware that the perfection and value of their works do not depend on quantity or on the satisfaction found in them, but on knowing how to practice self-denial in them. These beginners ought to do their part in striving after this self-denial, until God, in fact, brings them into the dark night and purifies them. In order to get our discussion of this dark night, I am passing over these imperfections hurriedly. Chapter 7. The imperfections of spiritual envy and sloth. 1. As for the other two vices, spiritual envy and sloth, these beginners also have many imperfections. In regard to envy, many of them feel sad about the spiritual good of others, and experience sensible grief in noting that their neighbour is ahead of them on the road to perfection, and they do not want to hear others praised. Learning of the virtues of others makes them sad. They cannot bear to hear others being praised without contradicting and undoing these compliments as much as possible. Their annoyance grows because they themselves do not receive these plaudits, and because they long for preference in everything. All of this is contrary to charity, which, as St. Paul says, rejoices in the truth. 1 Corinthians 13:6. If any envy accompanies charity, it is a holy envy by which they become sad at not having the virtues of others, rejoice that others have them, and are happy that all others are ahead of them in the service of God, since they themselves are so wanting in his service. 2. Also regarding spiritual sloth, these beginners usually become weary in exercises that are more spiritual and flee from them, since these exercises are contrary to sensory satisfaction. Since they are so used to finding delight in spiritual practices, they become bored when they do not find it. If they do not receive in prayer the satisfaction they crave for, I've read that wrong, hang on. If they do not receive in prayer the satisfaction they crave, for after all, it is fit that God withdraw this so as to try them, they do not want to return to it. Or at times they either give up prayer or go to it begrudgingly. Because of their sloth, they subordinate the way of perfection, which requires denying one's own will and satisfaction for God, to the pleasure and delight of their own will. As a result, they strive to satisfy their own will rather than God's. 5. Many of these beginners want God to desire what they want, and they become sad if they have to desire God's will. They feel an aversion toward adapting their will to God's. Hence, they frequently believe that what is not their will, or brings them no satisfaction, is not God's will, and, on the other hand, that if they are satisfied, God is too. They measure God by themselves, and not themselves by God, which is in opposition to his teaching in the gospel that those who lose their life for his sake will gain it, and those who desire to gain it will lose it. Matthew 16:25. 4. Beginners also become bored when told to do something unpleasant. Because they look for spiritual gratifications and delights, they are extremely lax in the fortitude and labour perfection demands. Like those who are reared in luxury, they run sadly from everything rough, and they are scandalised by the cross, in which spiritual delights are found. And in the more spiritual exercises, their boredom is greater, since they expect to go about in spiritual matters according to the whims and satisfactions of their own will. Entering by the narrow way of life about which Christ speaks is saddening and repugnant to them. Matthew 7:14. There's a footnote here. As John goes on, he makes it clearer that his arrangement of the night coincides with that mentioned in Ascent 1, 2-3. The passive night of the senses marks a transition from the stage of beginners to that of proficients. The passive night of the spirit, the transition from the stage of proficients to that of the perfect. 5. It is enough to have referred to the many imperfections of those who live in this beginner state, to see their need for God, to put them into the state of proficience. He does this by introducing them into the dark night, of which we will now speak. There, through pure dryness and interior darkness, he weans them from the breasts of these gratifications and delights, takes away all these trivialities and childish ways, and makes them acquire the virtues by very different means. No matter how earnestly beginners in all their actions and passions practice the mortification of self, they will never be able to do so entirely. Far from it, until God accomplishes it in them passively by means of the purgation of this night. May God be pleased to give me his divine light, that I may say something worthwhile about this subject, for in a night so dark and a matter so difficult to treat and expound, his enlightenment is very necessary. The verse then is, one dark night. So, I find this image very helpful of the mother putting the child down from the breast, not to be cruel to the child, but because she wants the best for it, that the child should grow, become mature, become more independent, be not dependent on her in this way, because eventually the child's going to grow up and then need to find its own food. So, even though it seems like cruelty to the child to be removed from the breast, the mother's doing it in the best interests of the child. And I find this very, very helpful in thinking about going through trials in life and spiritually. It can seem that God is very cruel. It doesn't seem to me that way anymore. There's such a lot to say about this, because people with a faith, or even people without a faith, are troubled by bad things that happen in the world, by suffering and injustice and that kind of thing. And it's very easy to be dismissive of God, or angry about God, and or angry with God, which isn't a problem, I don't think. Like, I've been angry with God very often, particularly when I was younger, but I've grown through that now. I don't feel angry with God, because I've come to a greater understanding of the nature of reality. And so God isn't in opposition to me. I don't see it as like a struggle with God, or God is in opposition to me, or is in opposition to creation, because suffering and death exist. I feel more like a collaborator with God, someone who cooperates with God, or it's important that that's what I try to do, to cooperate, to share in the redemptive suffering of Christ. and to be very confident that God's will is perfect. Whatever the outcome is for me personally, God's will is perfect. That doesn't mean that I suffer less in terms of the situation that I'm in. That I don't need to be asking myself, why is God doing this? For a start, God isn't doing this. Other people have decided to do this. God didn't do this to me. He did permit it. But he permitted it because I'm not saying it wouldn't have happened anyway. But I've only really... There's very few specific things that I've asked for myself. I know the psychobabblers think that I'm continually pleading with God that I should be a priest or a sister or something. And it makes it seem even more insane to them that I haven't concluded that God hates me or God doesn't exist because I'm constantly pleading for these things in their opinion, and God isn't answering me. That's the way they see it. So a rational person would conclude this is what they think, that God doesn't exist. But they're very childish and unsophisticated in their understanding of a life of faith, of a Christian life, of the meaning of these kind of life events, I suppose you could call them, on the Christian pilgrimage, journey, way. And so I'm kind of frustrated that people who are so damn stupid, to put it bluntly, feel they're in a position superior to me, to be judging me, and forcing all this crap on me continually. This is how they've convinced people in the church to be disrupting worship, disrupting mass, and playing spiteful games with the sacraments, because none of it has any reality to them. So they think it's like I'm going to, I don't know, socialise, impress the clergy or religious, and to kind of bargain with God. Like, if I want to go to mass every day, for example, I'm kind of saying to God, well, look, God, I'm so good, I'm going to mass every day, so you need to give me all these things that I want. And I think this is what their attitude is, because faith is so irrational to them, because they've been brainwashed with secularism and Marxism, that there has to be something defective in me that causes me to be so devoted. They don't see it as a positive thing at all. It's entirely negative, and I need to be cured of it. And if I am going to continue in this insanity of going to church, then I should be doing it in the Church of England, where people are much more reasonable and don't really believe it at all. This is their opinion. Like, it was beyond the pale for them that I should become a Catholic. It was just more evidence of my insanity. So I've just, like, because the more I've suffered, the more I've understood what Christ suffered for me. And far from diminishing my devotion and commitment to him, it's actually increased it. And I just want to be with him even more than I did before, because I love him so much. And all that he suffered, and he was on his own. He even said, why have you abandoned me to God? There's nothing I can experience that he hasn't already experienced. And because he's someone I love so much, it causes me pain to think of him going through that by himself. And I want to be with him. I don't want him to be alone. I said, when I was talking in Ubita to the friar who looks after the guests, and I said to him, I want to lay in the tomb with Jesus. Everything that I say is being reported to these fucking nutters And they put their own interpretation on it. So that was interpreted as like I'm going to go and commit suicide or something like that. I'm tired of these people who understand not the slightest thing about this way of life, this way of believing, this way of faith, who are judging me from things that have been invented in the last century. There's just thousands of years have passed with people managing extreme suffering, and much more extreme suffering on a daily basis than we would normally experience today in the West. And someone talking about this on a video on YouTube said once, I can't remember exactly when they said it, but it was something like 100 years ago, even the King of England didn't have such good healthcare as what everybody has today. And that struck me. I thought that's really true. Even very wealthy people didn't have many of the advantages that everybody has today in the West. Most people, anyway. So, first of all, they didn't have anaesthetics, for example. And I'm not saying anaesthetic isn't a good thing. But first of all, they anaesthetise the body so the body doesn't suffer anything. And now they want to anaesthetise the mind and the soul as well. They think that suffering is of no use. It's of no use. But as he's saying here, people who've lived very comfortable lives, they're more conflicted than people who learned to suffer when they were younger. I find it tiring hearing people complain about trivial things. I don't mean complaining once or twice like, I really wish this or that were different, but continually complaining about trivial things that are just a part of ordinary life. It tires me. What solution are they looking for? What's their solution to my inadequacy or pathology of mine? What is their solution to that? To bully and harass and drug me until I say what they want and behave exactly the way I want. The way they want, rather. Is that the solution then? They're just gonna bully and harass me and drug me and force all their psycho babble on me because I just have to be the way that they are, because otherwise they feel difficult about themselves, because they want to think about themselves as caring often, and so fixing me is to make them feel better, not to make me feel better, because it's made me feel 1,000 times worse. I'm struggling with suicidal feelings every day because there's nothing I can do to escape this constant abuse and harassment. I've chosen this way of life, and it's so deep in me that even if I wanted to change it, I couldn't. And I don't want to change it. I want to be close to Jesus. I want to be with him. I want to lay in the tomb with him. I don't want him to be alone. What are they going to do? I don't care what anyone else thinks about it. I'm not telling anyone else to do it. People just need to leave me alone and mind their own business. They have elevated opinions of themselves. and a very low opinion of me. I can't possibly be competent. Because I don't fit in with what they believe is a good life. I must feel this way or that way because I come from a working class background as well. This is another of their attitudes. It's very oppressive. I must feel this way or that way about it. In fact, that's one of the things that's most helped me to survive all of this. Growing up among people who didn't expect to get everything they wanted in life, who weren't constantly complaining every time some little thing went wrong. I don't know how I would have survived if I'd grown up more wealthy and I had a higher expectation of people treating me fairly and a higher expectation of gaining all the outcomes that I wanted in life. It would have been much harder to suffer all of this without that very solid grounding in reality that I was born into. Let me see where I should read to, because I've talked quite a lot. I'll just read the next chapter and then that's it. Chapter 8. The beginning of the exposition of this dark night, an explanation of verse 1 of the first stanza. 1. This night, which as we say is contemplation, causes two kinds of darkness or purgation in spiritual persons, according to the two parts of the soul, the sensory and the spiritual. Hence one night of purgation is sensory, by which the senses are purged and accommodated to the spirit, and the other night or purgation is spiritual, by which the spirit is purged and denuded as well as accommodated and prepared for union with God through love. The sensory night is common and happens to many. These are the beginners of whom we will treat first. The spiritual night is the lot of very few, those who have been tried and are proficient, and of whom we will speak afterward. There's a footnote here that says, as John goes on, he makes it clearer that his arrangement of the nights coincides with that mentioned in Ascent 1, 2-3. The passive night of the senses marks a transition from the stage of beginners to that of proficients. The passive night of the spirit, the transition from the stage of proficients to that of the perfect. 2. The first purgation or night is bitter and terrible to the senses, but nothing can be compared to the second, for it is horrible and frightful to the spirit. Because the sensory night is first in order, we will speak of it now briefly. It is a more common occurrence, so one finds more written on it. Then we will pass on to discuss more at length the spiritual night, for hardly anything has been said of it in sermons or in writing, and even the experience of it is rare. 3. Since the conduct of these beginners in the way of God is lowly and not too distant from love of pleasure and of self, as we explained, God desires to withdraw them from this base manner of loving and lead them on to a higher degree of divine love. And he desires to liberate them from the lowly exercise of the senses and of discursive meditation, by which they go in search of him so inadequately and with so many difficulties, and lead them into the exercise of spirit in which they become capable of a communion with God that is more abundant and more free of imperfections. God does this after beginners have exercised themselves for a time in the way of virtue and have persevered in meditation and prayer. For it is through the delight and satisfaction they experience in prayer that they have become detached from worldly things and have gained some spiritual strength in God. This strength has helped them somewhat to restrain their appetites for creatures, and through it they will be able to suffer a little oppression and dryness without turning back. Consequently, it is at the time they are going about their spiritual exercises with delight and satisfaction, when in their opinion the sun of divine favour is shining most brightly on them, that God darkens all this light and closes the door, and the spring of sweet spiritual water they were tasting as often and as long as they desired. I don't think I read that quite right. I was thinking about something else. It came into my mind. So I'm going to read it again. Consequently, it is at the time they are going about their spiritual exercises with delight and satisfaction, when in their opinion the sun of divine favour is shining most brightly on them, that God darkens all this light and closes the door, and the spring of sweet spiritual water they were tasting as often and as long as they desired. I've got it now, yeah. For since they were weak and tender, no door was closed to them, as St. John says in the book of Revelation, Revelation 3:8. God now leaves them in such darkness that they do not know which way to turn in their discursive imaginings. They cannot advance a step in meditation, as they used to, now that the interior sense faculties are engulfed in this night. He leaves them in such dryness that they not only fail to receive satisfaction and pleasure from their spiritual exercises and works, as they formerly did, but also find these exercises distasteful and bitter. As I said, when God sees that they have grown a little, he weans them from the sweet breast, so that they might be strengthened, lays aside their swaddling bands, and puts them down from his arms, that they may grow accustomed to walking by themselves. This change is a surprise to them, because everything seems to be functioning in reverse. 4. This usually happens to recollected beginners sooner than to others, since they are freer from occasions of backsliding and more quickly reform their appetites for worldly things. A reform of the appetites is the requirement for entering the happy night of the senses. Not much time ordinarily passes after the initial stages of their spiritual life before beginners start to enter this night of sense, and the majority of them do enter it because it is common to see them suffer these aridities. 5. We could adduce numerous passages from sacred scripture, for since this sensory purgation is so customary, we find a great many references to it throughout, especially in the Psalms and the Prophets. But I do not want to spend time citing them, because the prevalence of the experience of this night should be enough for those who are unable to find the scriptural references to it. That's the end of that chapter. Yeah. So the reason I find it in myself not to want Jesus to be alone, to be with him, is because I've suffered all this alone and I know what it means. Even before all of this started, what I was suffering in the Church of England, before this latter thing started around 2009, I mean, with everybody gang stalking me and so on, already for 10 years in the Anglican Church in England and Wales, I'd been suffering alone as people were inventing reasons for why I'd been rejected for ordination. This is one reason why I never talked about it to anyone when I came to Leeds. No one in the church. Maybe 2 people. But I didn't generally talk about it, and if people suggested I should be ordained, I kind of brushed it aside. I needed to get to a point where the Church of England acknowledged the way it had treated me previously. Not because I needed them to be grovelling or anything, but because I wasn't going to go through the whole process again. For them to just do the same thing and make up the same crap, and that's exactly what would have happened. Because they were trying to mind control me into saying something different, or accepting that I was defective in the way that they said I was. So I was suffering all of this for a decade, until 2004, when they kicked me out of the church for complaining about David Pete and his sexual perversions. And then there was another 5 years after that until 2009. So I've been suffering all of this all the time, also with a massive conspiracy going on behind my back, which I had some vague awareness of, but I didn't realise it was as bad as I thought. as bad as it was, rather. It's hard to talk when I can't hear myself talk, and especially this is... It's a stress talking about it. I'd already suffered all of that before the gang stalking even started. People treating me like I'm radioactive, that's what I mean. Like I'm going to somehow manifest into something dangerous to them. I didn't know what it was all about. It was quite difficult, and I didn't understand why. I was treated in a reasonable way when I was at work and stuff, and in educational institutions. But I was having to deal with this attitude all the time in the church. And I think they're just like that anyway to some degree. Anglican clergy, I mean. Because they're constantly told they're above everybody. And they need to be shaping the opinions and attitudes of people. And not even by preaching the gospel. It's all some political shit. So, yeah, I'd already gone through all of that alone. Before this even started, it prepared me. Because I was so used to this insinuated disapproval all the time, that when it became more overt, it was hardly anything. And it was terribly, terribly distressing. When it became everybody, in 2010, and then they sacked me from my job, and then they were all still gang stalking me, and they still wouldn't let me become a Catholic. And then the police kidnapped me from the cathedral and locked me up for 14 hours and tried to bully me into accepting a caution, because they were accusing me of harassing people when it was the other way around. And they said I was going to be banned from going in any Catholic churches. I can't. All of that at once, it was like being repeatedly smashed with a sledgehammer. I lost absolutely everything. Absolutely everything and everyone. In the space of only a few months. And that was on top of everything I'd been through before. And these fucking psychopaths are going round trying to convince people with some level of success that they did all this for my benefit. It's utterly incredible. And this is why I'm so alone. And when people are around me, I'm even more alone because they're all playing stupid mind games. I'm more alone with other people than I am by myself. And what are the psychobabblers going to do? Anaesthetise me so I don't make them feel bad. That's basically it. I've only got God to rely on, and they've tried their best to take him away from me as well. They can't understand this. They will never understand it. It is beyond their power of perception, because it's not something you can just understand at an intellectual level. It involves your whole being, the whole of your existence. I don't need people to understand me. I need them to mind their own business. I've never asked anybody for anything. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. There's something else that's been on my mind a lot in the last few days. I don't know how to talk about it on a video that's going to go on YouTube. So So I did a lot of research, academic research into St John of the Cross. And one thing I did was go to a conference in Ubeda in 2007, and the way that came about was I went for a retreat there. The first time I actually stayed there and didn't just visit the museum, visit the relics of St John of the Cross. I stayed there for a retreat, and I was talking to the friar who looked after the guests, and he said it's unusual for someone to come here from England. And I told him that I'd done this research into St John of the Cross. And so I was talking to him about my thesis, and he told me about the conference, and he said, oh, you could come to that, it would be very interesting to you. So that's how I came to go. And in case anyone was wondering why they didn't know about all of these things, is because I wasn't allowed to talk about them. I wasn't allowed to talk about what I wanted. I was shut down immediately. Here's an example. Related to... So I'm just going to relate a conversation, but I'm not going to say who I had it with. Where are you working at the moment? I've got 3 jobs. Well, what are your 3 jobs? Well, I'm working as a case coordinator at the Early Intervention in Psychosis Service. I've also got another job as a locum with the same employer, and I've got another job looking after a man with learning difficulties in his own home. You see, the reason I had 3 jobs is so I could earn money to go travelling. And the response I got to that was, no, you haven't got 3 jobs. So I say I've got 3 jobs. And this person responded, no, you haven't got 3 jobs. And also in a very irritated manner as well. And so I said, well, I have got 3 jobs, because I've got my one job as a case coordinator, which is a full-time job, 37.5 hours a week. And then I'm a locum worker in our hostels, which means when they're short-staffed, they call me in for a shift here and there. And then I'm also a locum worker for another charity where, when they're short-staffed, they call me and ask if I can do a shift taking care of this man who has learning difficulties. So I have got 3 jobs. So when I say I've got 3 jobs, and a person who knows nothing at all about my circumstances at home asks me, where are you working? And I tell him, and then he says, no, you haven't got 3 jobs. This is why I could never talk about anything. And this is why a later conversation was so wounding to me, one of the reasons. Apart from the fact that it was bringing up trauma from the past as well. But I'd already been treated in this very crappy way, over and over again, and only allowed to talk within certain parameters. Shut down and dismissed immediately if I started to talk about something he didn't want to hear about. So it was difficult. I don't know if I should have said all that on a video, but it's just been playing on my mind a lot in the last few days. I should have never trusted him. That's what I thought. And I was right, I shouldn't have. I don't know what that was all about. No one's ever said anything like that to me before. when I've said I've got 3 jobs, got really arsey about work. When I've said something like that, I mean, how can you say to someone who says they've got 3 jobs that they haven't got 3 jobs? Someone who's never had a job, more than likely. Do you know, my life was such a struggle. None of the jobs I wanted to do. I was trying to be able to travel, especially in Morocco, and I was working very hard. I was also going to language classes as well. 2 nights a week. I had a full-time job and 2 other jobs. Like, what is that about? It's gaslighting. That's how I was treated in the Church of England, you say. You state an obvious fact and they just tell you it isn't true. It wouldn't have affected me so badly. The later conversation. If I hadn't had all those experiences already of being shut down and dismissed.